Hello, hello, hello. Glad to see you. Glad you're here. Thank you for being here tonight on this beautiful Houston fall night. Welcome to this second installment of the 2024-2025 Inprint Margarett Brown reading series. Tonight featuring the acclaimed novelists Rumaan Alam and Danzy Senna, with their wonderful new novels, Entitlement and Color Television, in conversation with our friend and former Houston novelist and essayist. He's actually still a novelist and essayist. He's just a former Houstonian. Daniel Peña, who has come down from Dallas for the occasion. It's great to be back in the Morrison Theater, Brockman Hall for opera. Many thanks to Rice Shepherd School of Music Dean Matthew Loden, who is with us tonight, for making this evening possible. Thank you. My name's Rich Levy, Executive Director of Inprint. Since 1980, the Inprint Brown Reading Series has presented about 400 extraordinary writers from 39 countries. We work hard to bring you some of the world's best authors in a series accessible to everyone. Thank you for joining us on the journey. Upcoming, next Monday, it gets a little busy here, October 7th at the Alley Theater, we are excited to present Irish author Paul Lynch with his Booker Prize-winning novel, Prophet's Song, a rare opportunity to see Lynch, who arrives from Ireland the night before to launch his U.S. tour with us, so we promised to leave him alone that day. Paul will converse with our friend, author, and former Houston Chronicle book editor, Maggie Galhouse. Yeah. Then, 2 weeks later, we're keeping the hits coming. On October 21st, also at the Alley Theater, we welcome back to Houston Richard Powers, who was last here with Tayari Jones the week the Overstory won the Pulitzer Prize. He comes to us with his new novel, Playground. Richard will converse with beloved Rice professor and award-winning memoirist and essayist Lacey Johnson. General admission tickets, $5, free for students and seniors since 1980, are currently on sale for Paul Lynch, and tickets for Richard Powers go on sale tomorrow at noon at inprint.org. Season tickets are also on sale now, online or via QR code in the lobby. Inprint season subscribers receive great perks, including free books, best seats in the house, free parking, first-in-line book signing, and online access to the series. Details at inprint.org. To those who purchase season tickets, thank you. We also invite you to the online Inprint Book Club, which focuses on books by authors in this series. On Sunday, October 27th, we'll discuss Dinez Smith's new poetry collection, Bluff. The Inprint Escritores en la Casa series, featuring leading authors in Spanish, continues on October 24th with the award-winning novelist and singer-songwriter, Rita Indiana. We also offer the Inprint Cool Brains series for middle grade children, featuring on November 10th, three-time Newbery Honor Award winner Christina Suntornvat with her new book, The Squad. Free books for the first 100 children, bus scholarships for schools and community centers. We have 5 new Inprint workshops starting in October, all led by published authors. Inprint also offers free workshops across the city for seniors, teachers, healthcare providers, the incarcerated, and others, empowering folks to tell their stories. Info on all this, plus our archive of readings, support for emerging authors, and more, is at inprint.org. Excuse me. The Inprint Margarett Brown Reading Series is made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Arts. Inprint also receives invaluable support from the Brown Foundation. This series is named for one of its founders, the Jerry C. Deering Family Foundation, Houston Endowment, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, and the Texas Commission on the Arts, and our special thanks to Riverhead Books. Now, after Danzy and Rumaan read from and talk about their books, they will join in conversation with Daniel prize-winning author and professor of creative writing at University of North Texas. Formerly, he was based out of UNAM in Mexico City, where he worked as a Fulbright Garcia Robles scholar. And prior to Dallas, as you know, he lived here, teaching creative writing. His work has appeared in The Guardian, The Rumpus, NBC News, New York Times. His novel, Bang, is out now, and his debut essay collection, How to Look Away, is forthcoming this spring. We're happy Daniel is with us tonight. And afterwards, Danzy and Rumaan will sign books in the lobby. Brazos Bookstore, our bookseller since 1980, is here tonight offering a 10% discount on signed copies of Entitlement and colored television. And you can get that same discount online at brazosbookstore.com through Sunday. The discount code is Inprint. So you have to know how to spell our name. Rumaan Alam's third novel, the New York Times bestseller Leave the World Behind, gathered great acclaim as a finalist for the National Book Award, one of President Obama's summer reads, and the basis of a feature film. Roxane Gay called the book an exceptional examination of race and class and what the world looks like when it's ending, not at all different from the world we are in now. Rumaan's other best-selling novels include Rich and Pretty and That Kind of Mother. Rumaan joins us to read from and talk about his new novel, Entitlement. Set in the mid-2010s in New York City, it tells the story of a young woman who is hired to assist an octogenarian billionaire in his quest to give away a vast fortune, and how this job and relationship transform her. Joseph O'Neill in the New York Times calls it a psychological thriller that subtly turns into a vicious expose of affluent liberalism, which sneaks up on you and wins you over. A starred review in Kirkus states that Entitlement cements Alam's status as a talented truth teller, willing to tackle tough issues with grace, generosity, and sensitivity. And Charles Hughes says of the book, I love this, reading Entitlement felt like having a vice slowly tightened around my heart. Elegant, precise, devastating. Danzy Senna's best-selling debut novel, Caucasia, which James McBride called lucid and magnificent, won the Stephen Crane Award for Best New Fiction. Matt Johnson wrote of her third novel in hypnotizing prose, New People kicks you in the gut, then sings you a lullaby. Read this and be haunted. Senna is a master. She is also the author of 3 other acclaimed works, the novel Symptomatic, the nonfiction book Where Did You Sleep Last Night, a personal history, and the story collection You Are Free. Senna comes to us with her new novel, Colored Television, a portrait of a writer who sets out to complete her magnum opus, what her artist husband nicknames her mulatto, war, and peace. When the book does not launch her young family into the lap of luxury, she turns her sights to Hollywood. NPR calls it exhilarating yet poignant, endlessly quotable, true, and intensely, meaningfully provocative. And the Los Angeles Times describes it as a laugh-out-loud cultural comedy. This is the new great American novel. Danzy Senna has set the standard. Miranda July calls it addictive, hilarious, and relatable. Yes, but colored television is after something larger, more elusive, a very modern reckoning with the ambiguities triangulated by race, class, creativity, and love. What a joy to have these 2 remarkable simpatico authors on our stage with their compelling, exquisitely wrought new novels. Please give a warm Houston welcome to Danzy Senna and Rumaan Alam. And first up is Danzy.
Thank you so much for having me in this wonderful series, and thank you for the beautiful introduction, Rich. And I'm so thrilled to be here with my friend Rumaan and reading from my new book, Colored Television. And I live in Los Angeles. I've lived there for 18 years as a novelist. which is, I always say, is like being an Amish person. I go to parties and they say, what do you do? And I say, I'm a novelist. And they say, has any of your work been made? And so it's been an interesting place to be a literary fiction writer. And I sort of have always wanted to write my Los Angeles novel because I keep writing about Brooklyn. And I finally have done that, explored that in this novel. And it's about an alienated novelist who is also, it's like a little bit of a hall of mirrors. She's like me, half black and half white. She's living with her 2 children and her artist husband in Los Angeles. And they're really struggling with money issues and trying to figure out how to live as artists in this world, and in particular in a city like Los Angeles. And I'm going to read from the middle of the novel when she's just decided to try her hand in television writing. And one of the things I noticed over the last 10 years at the kind of height of prestige television was a lot of my novelist friends feeling very anxious about being replaced. So I was interested in that dynamic. The assistant who came to find Jane in the lobby had a perfect face, full lips, a pert round nose, high cheekbones, sloping eyes. Everything sat in balance on the canvas of her face, each feature at the right distance from the other. You must be Jane, she said. I'm Layla. We're so excited you could come today. Can I get you a water, a coffee? Water is fine. Jane recalled a lecture she'd attended in college. The professor told the class that faces were beautiful, not because they possessed features of any particular shape or mold. Faces, he said, were universally considered beautiful when they were symmetrical. After the class, Jane had gone to look at her own face in a compact mirror in the bathroom stall and saw that it was deeply asymmetrical. Some kind of Picasso-esque pairing. Jane wondered if Layla was the assistant's real name. She guessed she was the child of immigrants. It wasn't just her skin color, which carried a depth and richness you didn't see in America every day. It was her smile, too, so eager and hopeful, and her voice with a hint of the valley. As she followed Layla down a long hallway, Jane played a round of forensics in her head. Nigerian-American princess, daughter of rich doctors who'd moved from Lagos to La Jolla for grad school and decided to stay. Mother became a cosmetic dermatologist, father the premier cardiologist on the West Coast. They sent Layla to prep school in La Jolla, Torrey Pines, where, despite her perfect face, she was not noticed as pretty by the blue-eyed stoners who were her classmates. They'd reached the conference room at the end of the hall. Sorry for the state of things, Layla said, leading Jane inside. We moved in last week. Everything is just beginning. Boxes were piled in corners of the room, and the smell of fresh paint hung in the air. Nothing on the walls. Layla handed Jane a bottle, glass, blue, no label, and said Mr. Ford was on a call but would be there soon. Then she left Jane to wait alone in the conference room. Through the large window behind her was a view of the freeway in the distance. She stared out at its gray morass. Growing up on the East Coast, Jane had imagined California as mysterious, glamorous, sun-baked. She had not predicted this Los Angeles, antiseptic, asphalt, glitterless and hard, or how much of Hollywood felt like an enormous ad agency. Still, she knew she was lucky to be here, lucky to be having this meeting with this particular producer. She'd read about him last night on her laptop, Hampton Ford. The ink was still fresh on his multi-million-dollar development deal with the network. According to the article Marianne's office had forwarded to her, he had been brought on board by the network to create diverse content. The profile depicted him as a family man as well as a giant of the small screen. In the photo spread that went along with the piece, he'd been dressed by a team of stylists in a tuxedo and top hat. He was posing in mid-dance step, coming down a white staircase, smiling. Though when Jane looked closely at his face, she thought his smile looked stiff, his eyes tired. Lenny, who's her husband, beside her in bed, had leaned over to look at the screen. "That's the guy you're meeting?" He snorted, pitiful. "All that's missing is Shirley Temple." Jane had tried a little defensively to argue that the photo was ironic, that he was in on the joke. "Never assume anything in Hollywood is ironic," Lenny said, rolling over and putting on his headphones to go back to his Japanese. "That's your first mistake." Fuck Lenny and his platitudes. Fuck Lenny and his artistically pure high horse. She would not be here unless she'd needed to be here. She would not be here if she'd married a doctor. And yet, now that she was here, she couldn't believe she'd avoided this all so resolutely for years, in her Amish bonnet, her quill in hand. Anyway, those quaint novelistic days were over. Jane had been to 3 meetings already with other producers. A short white guy named Doug at a production studio in Culver City who wanted horror with a social justice edge. A blonde woman in mid-city named Allison who was interested in comedies about campus politics. A snappily dressed Korean-American woman, also named Jane, who was looking for female-centric content. The conversation she'd had with each of them had already faded into a blur of white noise in her head, pleasant but inconsequential. That, evidently, was what generals were, getting to know you sessions. If you vibed, you vibed. If there was a spark, it might lead to something else, a second meeting, a one-night stand, a marriage of the minds even. But like blind dates, mostly those generals went nowhere. All you had to show for your time was a free bottle of ice-cold water in a blue bottle. Could she take the bottle home with her? Or was it like a hotel bathrobe, something to be enjoyed but left behind for the next guest? So far, she had left them behind. Jane's focus in all the meetings had been to try not to seem desperate, too Dickensian. Not to mention the failed novel, the rapidly evaporating sabbatical, the child at home who needed help. None of the other producers had called her for a second meeting. Her idea was possibly too vague, or maybe it was that, as Lenny insisted, she was too smart for these fools, and they had nothing to offer her, even as material. She pulled out her phone to check her face. The makeup had not fixed everything. It had not balanced out what was fundamentally asymmetrical about her face, but she looked okay, as blank and poreless and presentable as could be expected. Just as she was putting the phone away, the door swung open. It was the man himself, dressed not like Bill Bojangles Robinson, but like a 45-year-old television producer with a 7-figure development deal at a major streaming network. Crisp white t-shirt, expensively torn jeans, bright high-tech sneakers. He looked slightly older than he did in the magazine spread, a little heavier, his face wearier. He wasn't traditionally handsome, but he had one of those big caricature-friendly faces that famous people often have. She would have recognized him in a restaurant across a room or in a car next to her in traffic. She would have pointed at him and said, "Oh my God, there's that guy. What's his name?" Because he wasn't quite famous enough that she'd remember his name, and Lenny would snort and say, "I have no idea who that is," and pretend not to recognize the guy even if he did. Jane stood up, flustered. "Hey," Hampton said, "have a seat. Thanks for coming in today." His voice was soft and scratchy, younger than she'd imagined. Layla followed behind, carrying a styrofoam container and a green smoothie in a plastic cup. Hampton sat down at the conference table, and Layla placed them in front of him, along with a plastic fork and a napkin. On the toilet last night, Jane had looked up his net worth. It felt strange to be sitting across from him knowing this information. "Sorry to eat in front of you," he said with a bashful smile. "I'm just coming from my trainer, and I'm starving." He opened the container and took his plastic fork and began to dive into a mass of pale gunk dotted with color, some kind of veggie egg white omelet from the smell. Layla sat beside him, scrolling on her phone. Jane watched him, thinking how all the things he'd brought into the room with him were things she'd like to have in her life, or at least in her vocabulary. Egg white omelet, green smoothie, trainer, assistant. "So I read your first book," he said. "Your agent sent it to me in Bali. I was on vacation with the fam. I read it on the beach. Wow, great stuff." Hampton eyed her across the table. "I mean, the story's really great, but I was vibing on your voice, Janet." "Jane," Layla corrected him. "Jane, of course." Jane told him she admired his work too, especially his latest series, which wasn't true. Lenny and she had tried to watch it, but had found it unbearably messagey. It was about a family of wealthy Black people living in the Palisades. The parents were wildly successful film executives, and their kids were all beautiful and neurotypical. The catch was this: the mother in the family felt guilty for their good fortune and decided to foster a child. The kid they ended up with was a 10-year-old white girl from a trailer park in Norco, California. Her parents were both in jail on fentanyl charges. The vulgar but oddly charming character of the girl seemed clearly based on Honey Boo Boo. At first, the whole family was horrified by the sassy, fat white child in their living room, but eventually she won them all over, and in the end they decided to adopt her. The culture clash was the running gag. All the ways Cookie didn't understand which fork to use and not to use the N-word, all the ways she rubbed the rich Black family the wrong way with her lying and stealing and general trailer park hijinks. The show was kind of a reboot of Different Strokes, but with the races reversed. "It's so clever," Jane said. "I love the episode about the ferret in the toilet." Hampton wrinkled his nose. "You did? I hated that show. It was total network schlock. I'm stoked to leave that shit behind. To be honest, Jane, I felt shackled. I'm going in a different direction here, all premium, edgy stuff. It's time." His omelet was done. He pushed the platter away and wiped his mouth, picked up the smoothie and took a sip, sneered. "I hate smoothies, but my trainer says I have to drink them." He sucked at it for a moment, his eyes watering with disgust, then put it down. "So tell me, why would a literary writer, a real full-grown professor—" "You're a professor, right?" Jane nodded. She wasn't actually a professor, but her students called her Professor Gibson. They didn't know the difference. "Why would a professor like yourself," he continued, "want to work in this TV swamp anyway? You know television is a swamp, right? Talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking." Jane's answer came smoothly. She'd given it 3 times, rehearsing it with the producers she'd met at the other generals. She told him that she'd been realizing over the past few years that the greatest writing being done today was for television, not for novels. She repeated the line that had played so well with Marianne and Carrie, her observation that even English professors, people who had devoted their lives to literature, talked to one another not about books, but about what they had watched on television last night. She said she'd decided that this was where her future lay, in this vibrant and collaborative medium, which was having a renaissance of sorts. She could see he was listening. She paused, took a sip of water. "Television is the novel of our times." Hampton cracked a bashful smile. "Wow, you really think so? That's wild. Well, I hope you're right, because I could never write a fucking novel. Now that shit looks hard." "Oh, it is," Jane said. "It's madness." Together, she and Hampton laughed, and she felt a surge of connection with him. Layla was still there beside him, but so engrossed in her phone that it was as if she wasn't there. "So tell me what kind of show you're thinking about, Jane," Hampton said. "I'm listening." Jane launched into her pitch, the one she'd been trying to bring into focus over the past few weeks in the other meetings. It was all there in her doomed novel. She'd been wrestling with this material for so long that she could talk about it in her sleep. It was all about her people, the mulatto people, whose stories, she explained, had been told up until now as a tragedy. The mulatto had been depicted on the one hand as dangerously sexual, like the half-crazed mulatta harlot in The Birth of a Nation, or the quadroon rapist Joe Christmas in Faulkner's Light in August. Or they were portrayed as sad and mopey, doomed to a life betwixt and between, like all those sad, bright yellow girls of the golden age of cinema, the ones with odd names like Piola and Pinky. Either way, the mulatto had been treated like a walking, talking predicament rather than an actual character. See, I have this theory, she told Hampton. Mulattoes are like the queer people of races. Like gay characters, you might have noticed, they always kill themselves in movies. So do mulattoes. Hampton's expression while she talked was difficult to read. She couldn't tell if he was bored or interested. I mean, she said, trying to wrap it up, we usually end up offing ourselves by Act 2, but in the show I want to make, see, I want to show mulattoes in a different light. Show us being, just regular, relatable. She hated the word relatable, which her students were always using, but it had come in handy here. Go on, Hampton said. So what I'm thinking, Jane said, is we make a comedy about a kooky but lovable mulatto family, present day, not an interracial couple, that's last century's news, but a pair of grown-up mulattoes who have married each other and have given birth to 2 second-generation mulatto kids, mulatto squared, a family with normal problems but with a mulatto twist. She was sweating. She took a sip from the blue bottle as she tried to read his face. Obviously, there's more to say, she said, but we could get into the, nitty-gritty later. She could hear that this still wasn't so much an idea as a premise, a place to begin, a situation. Hampton nodded. Yes, the nitty-gritty. He was watching her now, his eyes roving coolly over her hair and features. Can I ask you a question? Of course. What's your numbers breakdown, like percentages? I hope that's not offensive. He cracked a teasing smile. It's just that I know all you mixed nuts like to spit into vials. She laughed, not surprised or offended, only amused because he was right. And Lenny was wrong about this guy. Hampton Ford was no imbecile. He was a very sharp student of her people. Because it was true. Mulattoes did like to spit into vials. She'd done it herself a few years earlier. She'd sent her saliva to a genetic testing company. Every mixed person she knew had done it, some to more than one company, hoping for a different result. Lenny had warned her not to do it because her DNA would forevermore be in a database somewhere. But she had to know. Her quest to solve the quagmire of her background had been more important to her than getting away with murder someday. The results had come 4 weeks later with a pie chart that broke down her heritage. As expected, it was pure chaos, less biracial than rainbow pride flag. But it was an answer nonetheless to that ancient riddle, what's black and white and red all over? 30, she said now, I'm 30% West African. She was rounding up by 2 points. But in addition to the standard disclaimer about margins of error, there had been a footnote in the results saying some indeterminable 2% of her was unassigned, like a rogue seating situation, and could be from anywhere. She'd read that optimistically as extra African points. But Hampton was still eyeing her, and she sensed he didn't believe her. You got a family photo, he said. Mixed people love to carry around pictures of their families. I mean, you meet an old mixed nut like 75 fucking years old, and she's still got a picture of her parents and her siblings in her wallet in case somebody asks. Am I right? Jane saw what he was doing. He wanted proof, and she couldn't blame him. He followed the news. Every few months, there seemed to be another white woman exposed for pretending to be biracial or native or Latinx. Another white woman in mulatto face. They fucked it up for people like Jane, making her look like an imposter of herself. It was an odd new twist in the white people helping themselves to everything that isn't theirs trope. And he was right, too, that people like her did tend to carry around family photos, sometimes whole photo albums in the glove compartment, always at least one in their wallet. They kept them handy like yellow stars to show people how they'd come out the way they had. People were always asking. She felt Hampton watching her as she scrambled to open her purse and wallet to find the picture. It was a snapshot from 1978, pre-divorce, a few years before the restraining orders and the custody battle. Her mother and father stood side by side, smiling brightly in the squalor of their living room, as if they still thought they were special for marrying outside the race. She and her sister stood flanking them, looking somber and dubious, as if they knew what was coming. She handed the photo to Hampton. He looked at it, and something softened in his expression. He showed the photo to Layla. Look, doesn't her mom look like Patty Hearst? And her dad's got that Huey Newton vibe. Thank you.
Geez, that's a tough act to follow. Good thing Danzy and I are friends. I have been assured more than once that this is really a reading series. But I always say that when you want your kids to go to bed, you read to them. And so I usually read very briefly. But Rich has strong-armed me. So I won't read as briefly as I normally do, but I hope none of you fall asleep. Entitlement is a novel about a woman named Brooke. God, you know, I've read from this so many times you'd think I know exactly what page I'm turning to. It's about a woman named Brooke, a 33-year-old woman who goes to work for an 83-year-old billionaire, and what that job does to her. She's a young woman in search of a self, and like most Americans, she chooses to find that self at work. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning where Brooke is explaining to her mother who her new boss is. Bless you. Don't be embarrassed, everyone sneezes. He founded Jaffe Office Supply. Brooke knew the whole story. Asher Jaffe had taken over his paternal uncle's stationery shop. Asher registered at Brooklyn College to avoid being sent to Seoul, left before getting a degree, and opened an outpost in the financial district, catering to office supply managers instead of Flatbush school kids in need of pencils and rubbers. In time, there were trucks. Jaffe in a jiffy. Advertising Age called this slogan one of the greatest of the 20th century. Its 6 syllables contain its entire promise. It was written by Asher Jaffe himself. Just parenthetically, I wrote that slogan. And I think it's really good, so just saying. Asher bought out his uncle. He married a girl named Barbara and expanded into a catalog business. Asher was seer. He saw the inevitability of the computer, and Jaffe could be relied on for magnetic tape. Asher was overachiever. He realized he was providing paper for others to print on, so expanded into that business. Asher was lucky. That subsidiary business of printing pages of mazes and word searches to be laid on the plastic trays at thousands of McDonald's nationwide made him a millionaire. Asher and Barbara became parents the day Kennedy was shot. Linda Jaffe died at her desk at Cantor Fitzgerald 38 years later. A whole life in the parentheses between American tragedies. By September 11th, 2001, Asher was already a billionaire. Real estate, mostly. In the 1980s, he'd balked at expanding retail operations because his grandfather had taught him that it was wasteful to pay rent. By the magic of math, the malls he'd acquired in the name of thrift became more profitable than the ledgers and staplers still ferried about Chicago and San Francisco in yellow trucks emblazoned with that old-fashioned promise of a jiffy. His and Barbara's divorce occasioned a battle royale for custody of a Monet and the 81st Street townhouse. She got the painting, he got the mansion. He met Carol in one of those corporate photo ops men like him often had to endure. She was there to attest that Jaffe was an equal opportunity employer. That their first meeting was for the camera's benefit foreshadowed the tabloid's interest in the blonde from St. Paul, a gold digger who'd hit the mother lode, as they told it. Jaffe sold Jaffe before the recession destroyed the company. He was an informal economic advisor to the elder Bush's administration. Oh, how salient in Houston. Joined corporate boards, wrote a business book, paper thin, making $1 million out of nothing, monitored his money, and then resolved to give it all away. The man's own words about the death of his daughter were an early viral sensation for his friend Ariana's new publishing venture. Some actuary had sat down and done the math. Uncle Sam tendered $3 million of condolence. In the face of reality, Jaffe wrote, money means nothing. The question is how to make a life with meaning. So he was declaring it aloud. He would get rid of his money until he was left with only peace. There was disagreement on the internet as to Asher's net worth, but Brooke trusted Forbes, which put it around $3.7 billion. Like I said, that's usually the part I read because I don't want people to fall asleep when I do these events. And we were backstage, and Daniel very kindly told me what scene I should read to all of you. So I've actually never read this scene aloud, although I do read aloud when I write my books. So maybe there's some muscle memory of how to perform this. In that bit I read, you met Asher. It's also so funny to me. I mean, I've talked about this with Danzy before, but our books are weirdly so similar. They're both about a young woman or a youngish woman confronting a man with a lot of power and money, and that's what this sort of scene is about. Brooke is in the car with her boss, and they're on their way to an appointment, and I'll just read it. I don't know. Don't fall asleep, okay? The cell phone earned Asher's reproach. He thought younger people addicted. In some ways, he was just another old man dreaming of the way things once were. Brooke, beside him on the leather seat, nodded at the news from Natalie. Tessa, gray-suited woman of the Ford Foundation, had been struck by a car. Bad luck at a notorious Queens intersection. An anecdote about how life could change in a moment. Tessa wasn't indispensable, but it was unseemly not to cancel. Asher, our meeting has been postponed. The pedestrians on 42nd were moving more quickly than they were. He hated disruption. They insisted we come when there's nothing to... Should I ask Christopher to go back? As though he weren't right there, as though he were unable to hear. These jaunts to various Midtown conference rooms, Brooke had felt the driver watching. One day he spoke to her, the kinship of another black face or some paternal feeling. He had, he told her, 3 daughters. One was a nurse, one was in college, the youngest had tested into a Riverdale private school. He thought Brooke would want to know this, thought she would recognize something, that she was some version of his girls all grown up. Brooke was cool to him. She had little desire to be his child or his ally. He would be, to her, only what he was to Asher. Brooke read the boss's frown and explained the postponement. A general announcement to everyone involved. We're getting out at the corner. A suddenly surplus hour. Natalie would want him returned to the office. In her new proximity to the boss, Brooke was often deputized by Natalie. But it did not do to question Asher's caprice. The fundamental task was to make him happy. The car stopped and Asher was gone like a liberated pet. Brooke clamored after him. A summer day with a prevailing delirium, the liberation of a promised holiday, everyone a school kid once more. There's something I need to do anyway. Asked Natalie to send flowers. Asher crossed the street and continued uptown. When Brooke did, that afternoon, She would find that Natalie had already placed the order. Tourists took photos of nothing in particular. Midtown's cacophony of traffic and construction. Brooke admired how Asher seemed not to notice, not the slobs from the provinces or a glum woman with a fistful of leaflets, not the delivery men wielding trolleys or the bus driver exercising his vehicle's horn. Asher lived in some other better place, some improved reality. Should we get a coffee? He could hold forth and she could take notes. It was Asher's habit to say nothing when his answer was no. He turned onto 49th Street. There's something I need your help with. The air in the lobby of Christie's was beyond conditioned, Arctic, cryogenic. Maybe it had to do with the preservation of the masterpieces therein. There wasn't much to the place, white expanses of floor and wall as you'd find in museums. Brooke kept a modest wife's distance as Asher beckoned the receptionist. Can you tell Sarah I'm here, Asher Jaffe? Some strategy in how he wielded these names. Asher knew that even the girl at the desk would know who he was and be able to deduce which Sarah he had come in search of. It didn't pay to dawdle when Asher Jaffe beckoned. Sarah's body was not hampered by the taut pencil skirt or the lethal heels. This was a woman who knew what time meant to men like Asher Jaffe, the men, it was always men, she spent her career dealing with. She approached with outstretched hands and campaign smile. Mr. Jaffe. She lingered in the handshake for longer than most would have. She said that it was wonderful to see him. I hope it's okay. Asher tucked his hands into his pockets, dropping by. It's always a pleasure, don't be silly. She had her arm in his. This is my colleague, Brooke Orr. This moment of introduction had become a part of their show. Asher saw it as significant, and Brooke had come to rely on it. She was practicing eye contact, firm grip. Sarah glanced back at Brooke and said that meeting her, too, was a pleasure. Come, come, one and all. Sarah did not need to know whether this girl was mistress or money manager. She led them down a tiled hall and through a large set of swinging doors. There was more hallway, a turn, and another turn to a smaller set of double doors. These were opened to reveal a room, a chamber, high-ceilinged but windowless. The hush of a library, a sense of purpose so intent that silence seemed warranted. There was some generically handsome Greg or Craig in a black blazer, and there were 2 armchairs, and there was a painting larger than a person, upright, braced by steel. No, not a library. It was like a chapel. Sarah lingered behind them. She knew how to do this. Mr. Jaffe, welcome back, and Miss Orr. Here we are. Sea Level, Helen Frankenthaler, 1976. It's acrylic on canvas. The current owner acquired this directly from Andre Emmerich. It's been in that collection since. Asher did not want to seem old, but he wanted to sit. He took one of the leather armchairs. Here we are. His repetition was to buy himself time. The facts, yes, 1976, yes, Frankenthaler, yes, acrylic on canvas. But what was he supposed to feel? It's big. Brooke was unsure if she could or should, and then sat. Her mother owned a Frankenthaler lithograph, a small thing, a modest thing, but something of which Maggie was quite proud. What to do with that strange coincidence? Brooke could see her boss trying to make sense of the painting, misunderstanding how this worked. Sarah was talking about scale. To me, the word is vast, geologic. It makes you feel small, in this case, both literally and physically. Brooke watched Asher frown. She turned to see Sarah, hands clasped behind her back. An absurd attraction to the woman, as though they were sisters, and Asher, the distant father, each was eager to please. Sarah could sense her prey had less attention today than usual. She communicated with few words to the young man to adjust the lights. The piece is signed and dated on the back if you'd like to see. Asher pushed himself out of the chair. Well, let's see then. No point coming all this way not to. Brooke followed him. The two circled the big canvas. They lingered behind, sheltered from something in a private sanctuary. It felt wrong to see it from this angle, the thing so vulnerable, so nude. On a curl of the canvas, pencil scrawl, name, date, the title. She recoiled to see him touching the painting. But Precious was from museums. This was simply something to buy. It's Mrs. Jaffe's birthday next month. Asher thought ahead. Asher had always been generous. He was a man who availed himself of the pleasures of a great fortune. So what do we think? A woman would know, and women love to be asked about this kind of thing. It was a pleasure to feel dwarfed by the painting. It might fall on them, it might swallow them. There was an oceanic blue and the suggestion of mud and sunset. What did she think? What a question. It was self-evident. It was impossible to articulate. Fine. There was a word. Beautiful. This is not a piece that has traveled much or even been widely seen. Sarah loved that the painting was shy. The painting was a recluse. The painting was a mystery. If you ask me, and what do I know, Frankenthaler is undervalued right now. It's the male abstract expressionists most people want. I would be betting on Helen. He wouldn't brook this. It's a gift, not an investment. Everyone always talked at him about money as though this were the only thing he understood or cared about. The word for it was exhilarated. Like she'd run a race, the damp awareness, the heart in her ears where it did not belong. She didn't envy Asher a long European holiday, the stately car, the chauffeur, the rest of the stuff she couldn't quite imagine. Fine bed linens, custom shoes, food more delicious than what she got to eat. Maybe his towels were softer, his soap more fragrant, his coffee more potent. But that transcendence could be bought, it could be sold, and most people knew nothing about these transactions. Brooke simply marveled. This was what money got you. This. Christ. Sarah knew not to say more. It's a special piece. Brooke wanted to say that her mother had a Frankenthaler, that it was funny that Asher Jaffe brought her to this anonymous midtown room and showed her a Frankenthaler, that life sometimes organized itself around these motifs and you felt some responsibility to figure out what they meant. Asher stroked the canvas, index finger dipping into that pool of blue. Give me views, rooms, an object, something I recognize. The abstract stuff always feels like a test. She didn't wait for permission or invitation. This was her purpose. Brooke's education in art history had well prepared her, as though some long-gone version of herself had foreseen this very moment. That's the point. A mystery, a feeling. Brooke wasn't chiding him, but wanted to. An abstract painting was the shadow of the painter's body in motion. An old man should understand that. It's like everything. Cave painting. Kilroy was here. It's all human activity. It's meager. It's nothing. A shout into outer space. She pointed. There it was. The painting still endured. That was the miracle of it. That was the profundity of it. An idea Helen Frankenthaler had decades ago. And here it was. Asher alone of the people in that room could possess it. There was no justice there. It was a fact. Immortality. He liked this girl. He liked how she talked to him as he imagined he talked to others. Something about her almost reminded him of his mother, though what Ilona Jaffe would have made of that, who could say? Who's doing the selling here? You work for Christie's? Brooke knew that he wanted her to go on, and so she did. I don't know, Mrs. Jaffe, but how could anyone look at this and not feel? Asher was exasperated. That's my point. A litmus, if I don't get it, I'm at fault. I'm the one who's wrong. You are wrong. She was there to tell him the truth. You like Monet. She knew he'd once owned that Monet. You like Cézanne. She knew he still owned a still life. You don't see how it's the same thing? She's finishing what they started. She's beating them. You don't see how Monet would have loved this? If he were here, what would he say? He'd say, yes, the sea, of course. Asher sat back down. They're motivated to sell? So this was what it was back to. Brooke couldn't hear this business about whether the number was competitive. She didn't even want to look at the painting. It felt strange too. There's so much more. Sarah knew how to do this. We have the whole world. If you'd like me to take some time, no, this is it. There was no question anymore, was there? Immortality, as Brooke had told it. He liked that. I need it out in Connecticut before the 21st of July. Asher turned to his protege. You just cost me $850,000. Brooke had witnessed something that she barely understood. $850,000 seemed both deranged and simply what it was worth. What that affectless room must have seen. Rich people come to acquire the thing they alone could. Time itself. That's it. I'm taking a picture of this theater because a long time ago I did an event on stage and I took a picture and I was so glad that I did because how often do you get to be in a room like this, right? Like, it's so beautiful in here.
One more round of applause if we could.
Boy, girl, boy.
Oh, thanks to you both for that phenomenal reading and for reading the passages I was so excited about. I mean, for me, the idea that ties these incredible novels together is that, the core of one's identity is malleable and maybe perhaps negotiable in proximity to power. And I was wondering if you could both talk about the origins of these books, these phenomenal books, and the origins of Jane and Brooke.
You go first.
Okay. Well, as I was saying, I've lived in Los Angeles all these years, and Jane is sort of in all of these spaces where she's in between. She's in middle age. Her and her husband have a kind of strange relationship to class where they're highly educated. Some of you may recognize this class relationship. They have a lot of education. They're artists. They have proximity to people who have money, but neither of them have tenure. They're not making money off their art. Jane is writing about the mixed race experience, which I've written about as well for many decades, and is still a strangely sort of undertold and illegible category to be writing about in the racial binary. And she also is, as I said, between classes, between races, and between being young and being sort of firmly in her middle age. And I liked that sort of as a character to explore identity through because of the uncertainty of everything beneath her. Yeah.
I don't have an inciting incident that made me want to address what the book is addressing, but I'm very interested in the subject of money, and the book is really just about money. It really is, that is its principal preoccupation. But I think that money is I think money infects almost every province of contemporary existence. And once I realized that and articulated it that way to myself, I began to feel insane. And I really tried to identify territories of my own existence that felt immune from that. And let me tell you, it is a grim, don't do this exercise, because it is a very grim realization. Like, I think money, you might have actually heard me give this list before, but like the list as I came up with it is romantic love, family life, individual faith, and art. Those are spaces that I think are free of money. However, romantic love requires going on dates, which costs money. Family life is very expensive because my children eat a box of cereal every day. Art and the art market are one of the most significant economic indicators because billionaires trade art as a commodity. And religion is so wholly corrupted by money that, like, even if it's possible to have a private relationship with the spiritual, it's hard to reconcile that with the fact of, the Catholic Church owning most of the world's most priceless masterpieces. So I just think the realization that money was ever present in life is sort of like the animating force of the book.
Yeah, I mean, like, to this end, both of these novels speak to like this so-called new Gilded Age that a lot of people have been writing about, but they're set, yours I think is set, Rumaan, in the Obama years, like firmly in the Obama years, and yours, Danzy, is set in like kind of the contemporary era, like post-2020s.
Danzy cheated, and it's not set in any particular time.
Well, I began it before the pandemic, and then I had to put it away while my kids were home. And then I pulled it out of a drawer, and I was like, I don't want to deal with the pandemic. Yeah. I don't want to have to deal with Trump. So I just kind of ignored those two things. Yeah. It's in the vague present without some very important, powerful things.
It's a kind of craft answer, because I was like, why did they say it when they said it? But I guess that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But did you have, like, for entitlement, why, especially when there's so many, so many of the tropes feel so, and the themes feel so timely to like 2024, but it's set in like, I believe 2016, something like that?
Yeah, it's set in 2014. And actually, I'm sort of like teasing, but I think what Danzy is saying is actually very true and will be really prevalent in a lot of the novels that our colleagues produce in the next handful of years. I think if you're writing a book that is prosecuting a case about family life or the academy or whatever, you actually don't want it to be taken over by the pandemic or by Trump. And a fidelity to reality, because we both are realist writers, would require that. And so in many ways, I said it in 2014 simply to avoid what you were saying. And I think that's going to be very common for the literary novel. And I really do. And I also think, so it's effectively historical fiction, which is very grim and makes me feel very old. But like, what happens in this is the reader understands the distance of a decade, and so the reader is completing. There's a tension that the reader is aware of. In this book, like, there's sort of like a minor plot detail about the inevitability of a Hillary Clinton presidency, and the reader, of course, knows how the story ends, even if the characters don't, which is sort of another kind of nice thing about writing about like a somewhat removed past.
Yeah, no, Danzy, I love both these characters' vehicles for these kinds of, interrogations into those themes. But, Jane in color television felt like so transgressive and so irreverent. And I was curious about your relationship to humor and how, they seems like a vehicle for these really hard truths that you articulate, but sometimes you just say them and it's so funny. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, your relationship to humor, and humor as like a vehicle for these hard truths in your work through Jane.
Yeah, I think, I've always been drawn to things that are funny, but underneath the funny is a lot of sort of despair, rage, critique, they're barbed humor. And I really, learned that from my father. My father's very funny, but has really kind of scathing critiques of America built into his humor. And he grew up in the Jim Crow South. And I feel that, a lot of what he taught me is that humor is a weapon. And it is the only one that you may have. Is irony, humor, And what he means by that is your powers of observation, and that the way you tell a story can really cut to the truth. And sort of earnestness scares me. Like I find myself really shutting down with things that rest in that tone of earnestness. And so I've always been drawn to the way humor kind of flips the gaze around, and especially writing as someone of mixed race, Black, white heritage. That story, as I was saying in the novel, is usually told as a tragedy. And so for me to write it from a comic register, for me, feels like the more transgressive way to address these questions.
No, totally, yeah. I mean, likewise, I think about Brooke, who is at once our protagonist, we're supposed to be rooting for her, but is ultimately like one of these characters who can be like really unlikable. And it's what makes her complex.
High praise. Thank you.
No, but I found her to be a really, really complex character. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about writing into that territory, and then writing from an identity not, it's like close to you or similar. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm not a Black woman, so yes, far from my own experience. This is like a real hobby horse of mine, but I think likability is a useless metric for evaluating fiction, but it is very common these days, and I'm not really sure why. What I often say is that the only writer I'm aware of who writes truly likable characters is Richard Scarry. And even my children, by the time they were 6, were like, I'm a little bored of like the butcher and the baker and the housewife, because narrative requires friction and tension and conflict, and real people, unfortunately, are not that likable. And so if you want fidelity to reality, I don't think likability is a useful metric. I think it can be enchanting if you want to watch Mamma Mia on the plane, which of course I also want to do, but and actually even in Mamma Mia, they're not that likable. Like she's kind of a, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I just don't think I don't think it's a useful way of evaluating fiction, and I think actually most fiction should operate in sort of like a morally neutral territory, and should like negotiate with something bigger than like how the character is behaving or whether or not you would behave that way, because they're all made up.
Do you feel that pressure from readers to create this like
I do.
ultimate?
Yeah, I do. I mean, probably less than my colleagues who are women. I think that I think there's a little more latitude afforded to a man to play with that. But I do feel I'm sure you do too, I do feel this particular pressure.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, I think the only requirements for me are that the characters are interesting and that they make sense, that there's a sort of logic to their behavior, their bad behavior, that I'm not just doing it to sort of shock people, but that it's actually built on things that we understand. And so there's a feeling of causality, that when my characters go and do tell a lie, we get why they're telling that lie. But I'm always surprised at how much people say like Brooke or Jane or my last protagonists are unlikable, because I like them.
I know, I like them too. You can't write a whole novel with someone you dislike. It takes too long.
Yeah.
Like, you have to spend a lot of time with these.
Like, maybe we're morally neutral people, is what we're saying. But I didn't find anything. I mean, Brooke to me was fascinating.
Yeah, she's a weirdo, but like, I don't think she's, I don't know, I like her.
And
but,
I don't necessarily need my characters to be the person I want to sit around having coffee with. I need them to be an interesting protagonist. So it's not, the requirements aren't to be likable.
Totally. But ultimately, these sort of like vehicle for the Gilded Age ideology, this new Gilded Age ideology, which can be so interesting to me. Danzy, in early reviews of color television, much has been written about your decision to reclaim the word mulatto away from the pejorative meaning. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your decision to reclaim that word, because it's something that is also like a theme that's really salient within the novel.
Yeah, I at one point did a word count, and I was like, I think I used the word mulatto 100 times, or something like close to 100 times in this novel. And it's a word that me and my friends, who are all mixed race. Not all of my friends are, but the friends I have who are, we use that word liberally with one another. So I'm always afraid to say, everyone go use this word, because I don't think everyone should use this word. So guys, don't go out there, start asking people if they're mulatto. The word comes, from, it's a really problematic term. It comes from slavery. It's the word that the white slave owners used to describe people of black and white heritage, because they were trying to equate it with the Spanish word for mule, which is a mixture of a horse and a donkey, and also sort of is infertile. So built into the word is the idea that the races are different species and shouldn't mix. So it's a terrible word, I'll just say that. Yeah. But to me, it's also hilarious when used over and over again by a person of mixed race in this particular context, because I have that kind of sense of humor. And also, there's no other word to describe me. There's only the words multiracial and biracial, which are meaningless. They don't describe any particular mix. It's just you happen to have parents who were of different backgrounds. And so for me, the word mulatto, I'm not arguing for it, but it's to me at least specific in that it's coming out of a very specific history, and it describes a very specific combination of black and white Americans.
Yeah. I have kind of some nerdy craft questions for you guys. Thank you so much. The first of which is Rumaan, I mean, in terms of style, I feel like so much of the temporality, there's this squishing of time constantly within that book. With the painting was one of those great examples. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, the decision, or the way you play with time, but then also the way in which you jump between subjectivities.
Yeah, I didn't. Okay, so I said, I'd never read that out loud. I mean, I've read it aloud to myself, but then reading it out loud to you guys, I was like, oh, this book is confusing. It jumps, it knows what's happening in every single person's head. And it doesn't explain that to you, it simply does it, which is not something I made up. It's something that I actually don't think it's possible to really make up anything in this. We are practitioners of something that you can't actually invent anymore. You can only inherit, but it's something that's very out of fashion. It's something I associate with the Victorian novel, with the novelist as God, and it's actually something that I stole. I used it in my last book too. I didn't steal, but I adapted from reading to my children. Because I was reading The Wizard of Oz to my younger son, who was littler than at the time, and I don't know. That book is scary. It's scarier than the movie. And there were parts where he would put his hands over his ears or put his head under the pillow, but he still wanted to hear it. And I would interject into the text and tell him what was going to happen. And I realized that's how this book functions. I mean, my last book does it more authorially, and this book does it more perspectively, or with respect to perspective. What was so the style that technique is in service of advancing the storytelling, and in terms of how I control time, the truth is that I cannot control time. I do not know how novelists do it, and that is actually the engine of the novel as a form, unless you're an experimental novelist. Time has to pass. So when I read a novelist like Richard Powers, who's coming here, right, that guy really knows how to write a novel. It can go, across a century. He wrote a novel called Gain, extraordinary book, in which these two narratives work toward one another over the 20th century. And when you realize how it works, you're, breathless because it's so moving. Anyway, I don't know how to do that. I do not know how to do that. So I cheat, and I make my books really have a tight timeline. My last book covered 72 hours, and even then, I lost track of the time. And it's actually not clear. If you read the book really carefully, you realize that it's unclear how much time has passed, and this book covers 2 months. I can't do it.
One thing I thought was very funny about hearing you read that scene right after my scene, I was like, oh, in New York, wealth buys you art and immortality. In LA, it gets you a smoothie, a trainer, an egg white omelet, and maybe a streaming deal.
But they're the same thing. They're
Yeah,
the same
the
thing.
dynamic's the same.
The egg white omelet is a bid at immortality.
Yeah,
right?
it is. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I was curious too. I mean, Danzy, about like Finn as a character. It's very seldom that we see a character like that on the spectrum in this, and it felt like so poignant in this book. I felt like very sort of well done, and also like crucial to the almost like it's like a facet of Jane, right? Being parenthood and stuff like this.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Jane has 2 children, and the novel opens with her at a park with her son, who's 5, and has just been diagnosed with something unnamed that, she doesn't say, but it's something neurodivergent by a doctor. And she's a writer, and her husband's an artist, and they're kind of bewildered because everything they thought was special and interesting about their little boy has now been read as a symptom of this disorder by this doctor. And him liking to swing a lot, and him drawing the same picture over and over again. Yeah. And so throughout the novel, and you were talking about all these different elements of one's life in which money plays a factor. And one of those elements is ability and disability. And having a child with a special need, that sort of amps up the tension for her to get money, and she can't make money off of fiction. So one's life is really impacted majorly when you have some kind of special, thing that needs treating. And so, but I was also interested in him as he's sort of illegible to the world, and yet the world is trying to read him and label and categorize him in the same way that she's being read and constantly categorized. So it was a way of kind of expanding this question of identity and legibility to kind of a larger existential level, where it's happening in all these different areas of her life.
Yeah. I mean, to this end, both of these works, in a way, feel like extended meditations of family, and in either in the work itself or in interviews you guys have done, you've offered up ideas about how parenthood interfaces with the work. And I was curious about how parenthood and maybe family informs even your own work on like a craft level. I'm so curious. We talked about that a little bit backstage.
I mean, I have one awful thing I can admit, was that almost throughout the entire novel, Jane's children are on screens. And I realized at a certain point that it was like she was exhausted by those children, and so was I. So I was like, give them an iPad, Jane.
That's a post-pandemic learning, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love being asked this question, because the truth is that family is the engine of most fiction, with the possible exception of the techno thriller. And yet, interestingly, men are very rarely asked about this. Family is the locus of narrative. What are you writing a book about if not that? The workplace? Even the workplace is effectively a story about family. And again, I wasn't intending to get so preachy about this, but often the work of my colleagues like Danzy is talked about as being about family, and the work of guys like me doesn't have to be, because there's sort of there is inescapably a gendered or prioritized. There's a weight to it. Jonathan Franzen writes about family. But so does Alice Munro, or so did Alice Munro. And is Alice Munro's work domestic and therefore small in a way that Jonathan Franzen's is not? I think it's sort of like a matter of semantics. But yes, my work is all about family, and it's all about my family, which is it's meaningless to most people. The particular ways in which my children affect what I write about has to be meaningless to the people for whom I'm writing, because I can't go to your house with you and explain it to you. It has to be inside of the book. And so there are all these real specifics from my life that are present in the text that are meaningful literally to 3 people. And that's my husband and my kids. And my kids will never read my work. Maybe. I don't know. Have your kids read? Yeah, they're never going to read my work. So, they're too busy. They're on screens, like Danzy's fictional kids. So, but family has also men are rarely asked this question too, but when you have children, you have to become more efficient. You really have to.
Yeah.
And when my children were small, I mean, I should have won a MacArthur for this. Like, I could do the laundry, make dinner, hold one baby, because I had to hold him the whole time, and like read a story to the other kid, all at the same time. And you actually don't have a choice. And like, I feel like there are women in here who are laughing because they're like, yeah, we all deserve a MacArthur. We all literally know exactly what you're talking about. And I think that sharpened my ability to work. Because now I'm much more efficient with my time. I don't know what I was doing. I didn't have kids until I was 32. What was I doing in all those years?
I mean, I feel like I didn't write less when I had kids. I just lost my friends and my social life and my
too.
exercise.
Yeah. I never saw a movie.
Everything else went,
exactly.
But the kids and the work were the only two things that remained.
That's rad. I really enjoyed all that. I mean, both of these works feel incredibly timely, and they both feel like sort of like. Why do you think it is that they like? I was wondering if you had general thoughts on like even the concept of like the new Gilded Age and like this moment that we're in right now, massive stratification of wealth, and also just sort of how the individual, even Jane and Brooke, interface with this. And to this end, I think about like try to maintain, not like or gain really dignity within this moment.
I mean, I can't really separate mine from Los Angeles, actually, and the particular aspirational desperation of that city, where, you meet everybody, every Uber driver I've ever had on the way to LAX is an actor or screenwriter who's just 2 meetings away from becoming Brad Pitt. And, it affects every element of the culture there, and I wanted Jane to have that feeling of desperation and have it hit her as a novelist really hard, because I wrote this at the kind of height of the prestige television, and it was this feeling that suddenly, this form of storytelling was replacing the form that I had been working in for 30 years, and novels were last century's storytelling mode, and this was this one. And there was a sense also at the same time that it was the sort of post-George Floyd, sudden woke signaling, all these industries buying up stories about quite diverse content. And there was a sense amongst me and my friends who are writers of color, who are sort of peripheral, but maybe working in Hollywood, or even in publishing, that there was a time limit on how long the kind of Robin DiAngelo haze was going to last. And you better get your deal now, because 6 months from now, it's going to revert to whiteness. Yeah. And it happened. So, sorry.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Tell us what you really think, Danzy.
Yeah.
Happily, I don't think like the novelist can really answer most questions. I think they can really only ask them. This doesn't happen inside the timeline of my book, but it distills perfectly what I think the book is about. But in 2019, when Notre Dame burned down, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm boring Danzy because I feel like we've done events together, so she's heard all of my shtick. When Notre Dame burned down, a French billionaire named Francois Pinault, that night, while it was still burning, said, I'm going to give 250 million euro to restore Notre Dame, and was sort of roundly celebrated for this. And this guy, if you can imagine, there's another French luxury goods billionaire named Bernard Arnault, who is his rival, who said, okay, well, I will also give 250 million euro, because he wasn't going to let his rival best him. And both of these men were roundly celebrated for this. Bernard Arnault, the latter man, I did the math, I'm not good at doing math, but this is the equivalent of me giving the Notre Dame rebuilding effort $10,000, which is a lot of money, but I could do it. Like if my sister needed $10,000, I would give it to her. So this is not really generosity. It's something else. And Notre Dame, let's not forget, is the house of God. So we live in a society that is so warped that these two French twerps are going to restore the house of God and be, rewarded for it. It's upside down. It's crazy. It's crazy making. And I think that was sort of like the impulse for this book.
Right on, yeah. In lieu of, this is our last question, but in lieu of asking what's next, it's like the worst question. What's next? I like to ask, you guys are in the midst of these massive media campaigns. How are you surviving and what is giving you energy right now?
Did you see how panicked we both looked when you said what's next? We were all like, what? Do we have to do this again?
We're gonna be in a race to complete our next books. Actually, we're starting on the same date, and I'm serious.
That's what's next. Yes.
We're actually gonna
We're gonna keep this show on the road.
Yeah. Try to time it. I think I luckily had a break. I was on a 10-city book tour, and I had to do one city a day for 10 days, and it was a lot for my middle-aged self. I was like, this is for the young or the coke-addicted, and I was neither. So that was strange. But I started publishing in the 90s, and my first novel I tried to sell for years, really. I was trying to get interest in it. And what's interesting is to kind of track over my 6 books, like the change in the world and the population I'm writing about has kind of finally kind of come of numbers. There are more numbers of us and more visibility. So there's a little bit of a sense that people are understanding the world I'm writing about because everyone has that world in their life.
Yeah.
And it was much more illegible to the culture in the beginning of my career. Yeah.
I don't even really know. I think it's important, I think you would agree with this, to understand the publishing part of this job as distinct from the writing part of this job. And so at the moment, we're having this conversation, it's in the publishing part. And when this aspect of the job concludes, I get to retreat to the writing part. Yeah. And, my world is very small. I no longer teach, I don't do anything at all, honestly. I go to my office and I write, and then I go home and I make dinner. And I think this part of existing in the world and having the friction of experience and travel is really useful for that part, because it's like an intake output system, and you need to take in before you can sit down and write, which is why I'm very frustrated. The next time I come to the Inprint reading series, Danzy and I, you can book us again. We have to do it not on a Monday, because I really wanted to go to the Menil collection on this trip, because I feel like that is the thing. Those are the things that I find really provide something necessary and hard to name for my work. Reading, being with my kids, and having this private experience with art is that's what sort of fills it up for me. Yeah.
Our lives have to be very boring for us to write really interesting
really true.
Fiction.
That is really true.
So this is all too exciting for us to actually be writing.
Well, you guys did great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Danzy Senna, Rumaan Alam.
Thank you.
All right.